Hello. I hope everyone is safe and warm during this snow emergency. I know by now you have read part one and probably started on part two, but there were just a few aspects of part one that I wanted to touch on. This course and the next course thesis, we're going to be studying empirical research because that is what we are going to be doing. Empirical research is based on observations. It's based on things that we can see, touch, or feel. It is different from, say, mathematical proofs that are based on deductions. It's different from reliance on authority, where we believe something is true because someone said it was true. Empirical research lends itself to the use of the scientific method. Now, empirical research requires that we carefully plan the why, the whom, and how of our research. The why, we have to figure out either a research purpose, a research question, or a research hypothesis. The whom requires that we address the question of which population we're studying, or what sample of a population is the subject of the research. The how asks the question of what method we're using, what measures we're going to use to conduct our study. I'd like you to pause for a minute and think about things that can be observed. What observations have you made recently that lend themselves to questions? For instance, have you watched something on the news and thought, why is that happening? Or how does that happen? That's the start of the empirical method. What would be the why, the whom, and the how of a study based on the question or hypothesis or purpose arising from that observation? Research is either quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative research is when we gather data in such a way that it's easy to quantify, meaning that we can reduce it to some type of numerical value that will allow for statistical analysis. Quantitative research includes all experimental research and all non-experimental research, except for historical research, can also be quantitative. Research can also be qualitative. Some research. Qualitative research, data is analyzed through the use of informed judgment, where we are identifying major themes or minor themes or expressions. It's described using words rather than numerical values. One method example used in qualitative research is the use of open-ended interview questions. The biggest distinction in research is whether this research is experimental research or non-experimental research. In experimental research, the researcher gives a treatment and observes to see if there are changes in behavior. In experimental research, we are looking for cause and effect relationships. Does one thing cause something else? Now, the classic experimental method uses a control group and an experimental group. The control group receives the particular treatment. The experimental group does not. Both groups are randomly selected. Now, what makes research experimental is that the researcher administers or either arranges for the administration of a particular treatment. Experiments can have as few as one group of participants or multiple groups of participants. Can you think of an experimental research that's perhaps derived from the observations that I asked you to think about in the previous slide? What would be the cause and effect relationships being studied? And it's okay to pause the slides to think about those questions. What would be the treatment? For non-experimental research, no treatment is administered. With non-experimental research, participants are observed so we can describe them as they naturally exist. Some types of methods we use might be surveys, polls, field observations. Can you think of an example of a non-experimental study? Is it possible that the same type of research purpose can be addressed using an experiment or be non-experimental? Stop for a minute to consider these questions. One non-experimental method that also addresses cause and effect relationships that we find addressed in experimental studies is the causal comparative method, or the ex post facto study. Sometimes we call that quasi-experimental. There are no treatments involved, just descriptions of observations. With causal comparative studies, we use these when we're interested in examining causality, but it's not possible to conduct an experiment. Experiments may not be possible for ethical reasons, legal reasons, financial reasons, or many other issues. And in those situations, a causal comparative study may be used. The characteristics of a causal comparative study is that the researcher observes and describes a current condition, and most importantly, the researcher looks to the past in an effort to identify a possible causation. So, for instance, for instance, let's say I was interested in considering whether legalization of marijuana leads to increases in children who are testing positive for exposure to marijuana. Now, clearly, that is not an experiment that I would set up with a control and experimental group because it would be unethical. But I could take a jurisdiction like the District of Columbia, like Colorado, or several other jurisdictions that have legalized marijuana. I might look at the number of children who are admitted to hospitals and are testing positive for marijuana in their system at a certain point in time after this law has been passed, and I might compare that to that same phenomenon, the presence of marijuana in their blood, prior to the passage of the law. That's just one example. Try to think of some other causal comparative studies. With causal comparative studies, it is very, very important that the group that you're looking at after matches the demographic characteristics of the population before. Now, we'll talk about demographic characteristics later in the course, but basically, we're talking about background characteristics. They could be gender, age, socioeconomic status, all depending on the subject of the group. Causal comparative studies also have pitfalls, but not as many as experimental studies. There are other types of non-experimental research as well. Now, these are all non-causal studies, meaning that we are not looking for a cause and effect relationship in these studies. It could be a survey or poll. The purpose of that is to determine or describe the attitudes or beliefs and behaviors of a population. Now, to do that, we probably wouldn't use the whole population unless it was a small population. We would start with a sample of the population. We would study that sample. In other words, we would survey them. And then we would make inferences to the larger population from the data that we got from the sample. Now, if we were using the entire population, then it would be called a census instead of a sample. With case studies, we are only using one participant or one entity. And the idea is to obtain a thorough knowledge of the particular subject, in depth, whether we're talking individual, entity, or a situation even can be the subject of a case study. And in this situation, we're looking at them either over a long period of time or looking at a variety of different issues surrounding them. We have longitudinal research. With longitudinal research, we're tracing developmental trends through repeated measures over a period of time, 10 years, 20 years. With correlational research, we're looking at the degree of relationship among two or more quantitative variables. Not does one cause the other, which would be causal, but rather, are they related, and if so, how strongly? With historical research, we're looking at information so we can understand the dynamics of the past and perhaps use that to analyze present situations. Historical research, unlike the others, is typically qualitative, although, depending on how it's structured, it can be quantitative. The articles that you read probably all mentioned at least one of the prior types of methodologies, whether experimental or non-experimental. As a practical matter, you all will be using non-experimental methods for your thesis. Obviously, because you cannot conduct experimental research with people in the types of subjects that you'll be using in the field of Homeland Security. The one exception is if you choose to develop a computer model, and we'll go over some software where you can simulate behavior. And in that case, you can set up an experimental design. Now, whether we're talking about experimental or non-experimental studies, you're going to have variables. And I'm sure you encountered the term variable in your readings. Now, a variable is a trait or characteristic that has two or more categories. The participants can vary in terms of the category to which they belong. However, the categories are mutually exclusive. So a variable will have several categories. You can only belong to one of the categories. And all of the categories have been identified. So for instance, think about maybe surveys that you have completed. And you'll have a choice of options, and maybe the final one is none of the above. That gets the exhaustive nature in, because obviously you can't think of everything. So then there's kind of like that catch-all category. Now, variables, we have independent variables and we have dependent variables. An independent variable is the stimulus or the input or the treatment variable. Treatment if we're talking about an experiment. Otherwise, it's the input. The dependent variable is the outcome or the response. So you think of it as the dependent variable is the variable that's being acted on by the independent variable. Now, usually in your title, the independent variable goes first. Now, if we're talking about experiment, all experiments have at least one independent and one dependent variable. The purpose of experiments is to estimate the extent to which the independent variable causes a change in the dependent variable. With non-experimental studies, we're looking at the relationship between the independent and the dependent variables. All studies have a research hypothesis, a purpose, or a question. Remember, we mentioned these in the very first slide. A research hypothesis is a prediction of the outcome of a study. This prediction can be based on an educated guess or formal theory. Now, when I say educated guess, I don't mean a guess off the top of your head. But think of the research that you have already started doing in your critical annotations. So at a certain point, based on having read a series of articles and other research, you could then make an educated guess. That would be your research hypothesis. Now, a research hypothesis can either be directional, and it predicts which of your groups will have more of the attribute or will rank higher, or it can be non-directional, where you predict that there is a difference between your groups, but not the direction of the difference. Now, we can also have a research purpose, which simply states the purpose of the research. And it starts something like, the purpose of this research is to. A research question is a question that the research is intended to answer. Now, a research question cannot require a simple yes or no answer. If it requires a simple yes or no answer, then it is not researchable. Generally, so it would not be framed, does something cause something else? The answer would either be yes or no. It would be something like a why or a how. We will also get more into these, in fact, this week. Variables have to be defined. We call it operationalizing our variables. And it involves defining the variable so that it can be measured. And it requires identification of the precise steps required for that identification. In other words, what steps have to be present for us to know that our variable either exists or it doesn't? This is for two reasons. One, so we can research it. You can't research something if you can't recognize its presence. But more importantly, so it can be replicated. Good research is able to be replicated. That means someone else can take it, follow your methodology, follow the steps you outline, like the recipe in a cookbook, and they should come up with the same results that you had. That is not possible if your variables are poorly defined. Finally, I just want to talk about a few more things. Program evaluation is also a type of research. Some of you, for instance, who are already working in the field may want to do an evaluation of some program or policy that you're working with. Program evaluation is applied research where we're looking at the implementation and effectiveness of a program. It could be formative, summative, or final. Now, formative evaluation is collected during the course of the program and is used to assist in modifying the program during its implementation. Summative evaluations are when information is collected about the final and long-term benefits of the program. In other words, it's collected at the end, right? And basically, it's answering the question of, well, did this program do what we thought it would do? Or did it address the needs presented in the needs assessment done prior to the development and implementation of the program? Now, a good final program evaluation includes both a formative evaluation, a summative evaluation, as well as links back to the needs assessment to see if the needs assessment was addressed. Ethical considerations in research are vital. You cannot conduct research without considering the ethics, particularly if we're talking about people or involving what we refer to as human subjects. Now, the key to ethical considerations in research are informed consent and then a debrief. Informed consent includes 5 characteristics, basically. In other words, you inform the subjects of this, and they give their consent prior to the study beginning. The general purpose of the research, what will be done to them during the research, the potential benefits to themselves and to others, the potential for harm, particularly to themselves, and most importantly, the fact that they could withdraw at any time without penalty during the study. At the conclusion of the study, there should be what we call a debrief. It involves meeting with the participants and reviewing the purpose of the study, the procedures used, and offering to share results when they become available. It also includes, for sensitive subjects of study, informing the subjects of additional people they can see, such if they need counselors. Now, you're going to look at this in depth when you do your responsible conduct of research. The online course, which is the information is provided in your syllabus, and remember the deadline for that is February the 4th. Now, we're not having class on February the 4th because I'm giving you that additional time to do that online course, but I should let you know it actually requires more than the 3 hours of class time. Finally, what is the role of theory in research? What is a theory? Okay. A theory is really just an explanation of reality, or what's referred to as a unified explanation of particular phenomenon. Think for a minute, if I were to ask you, what is your theory of motive, why some students study and others don't? You would think and you would come up with a theory. It's an explanation of reality. Theories can be tested. Think theory in terms of connection with the 2 major functions of research. Okay? With deduction, and this is not the mathematical deductiveness, this is the research deduction. Deduction, we start with a theory. And from that theory, we deduce a hypothesis. Remember, I said a hypothesis is a prediction of what the outcome will be. You conduct the research, and if the hypothesis is confirmed, then support is lent to the underlying theory. If the hypothesis is disproved, then it tends to undercut the theory in that instance. It might be necessary to modify the theory. But this is why we do research. With induction, you start with observations. You conduct your research to answer a question, research question or research purpose. You draw conclusions from that research, and then you use that to come up with or induce a theory. Yes, there's always homework. Now remember, in addition to reading part 2, and in addition to doing the 3 to 5 critical annotations that you're supposed to do every week on the subject you think you're interested in, a new assignment has been posted in Blackboard. This assignment is basically very beginning, it's the initial start, where you're asked to come up with either a research question, research purpose, or hypothesis, identify the variables in your hypothesis, question, or purpose, and then operationalize those variables. Now, this isn't something you have to make about the blue. By now, you should be reading you should have accumulated 6 to 10 critical annotations, which means you've done enough reading to start formulating a theory or research question or purpose. And it will contain variables. But you don't just define those variables out of the blue. Those variables are based on your readings. The variables have probably been used by other people. How did they define them? As you actually start writing your thesis, you will describe this in your literature review and explain, where you got some of the information that led you to operationalize your variables the way you did. But for now, for a start, we're going to start with your research purpose, hypothesis, or question, identify your variables, and operationalize those variables. And yes, I know it's going to be difficult and challenging, but the only way to learn how to research is actually to do it. And this is the first step, and it will change and improve as we go along. But if you don't make the first steps, then you can't get to the next process. This assignment should be uploaded to Blackboard before class. So always bring a copy to class because we will be doing something with it in class. And I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.